So how would you describe the state of Portland streets?
Rough and really depressing, the worst in my adult lifetime. They feel dangerous, they feel unwelcoming, and sometimes unusable.
Mm-hmm. You say City Hall's ineffective, ideologically driven policies are ruining the city that we used to proudly call home. What do you mean by that as it pertains to the homeless crisis?
Well, we don't drive the discussion with data, and let me be very specific. We tend to homogenize the issue, describe it entirely as an affordability challenge, and when you dig into the data, particularly with respect to the unsheltered, those who we interact with daily on the streets, we have a substantial crisis of disabilities. 1 and 2 on that list are addiction and mental illness. Substantial number are suffering from both. And so we hear policymakers describe it as an affordability issue and and describe a need for long-term investment in housing. But when you dig into the data, we have an addiction and mental illness crisis on the streets of Portland that are really where the solutions need to be tailored to. So I'd start with that when we're talking about the homeless.
Mm-hmm. In your eyes, what isn't working with how the city is handling the homeless crisis, and how could you change that?
Yeah, we're not building nearly enough shelter. And I define that very broadly, everything from safe sleeping spaces to high barrier shelter. We have prioritized, and let me be clear, when we're talking about the homeless, this is a city, county, and state challenge, right? So looking collectively at the different levers on that issue. But collectively, we've underinvested in shelter. We've told Portlanders they need to wait to address some of the crisis on our streets until there's enough affordable housing in the area. That day may never come. We may never build enough affordable housing. So to expect Portlanders to wait indefinitely until that day, I just think is incredibly misplaced. And so we need to prioritize shelter to address the inhumane living conditions on our streets, to congregate services, including mental illness, addiction, and job training, and as well as to give some relief to Portlanders, taxpayers, whether seniors or those with young families that are relying on sidewalks to move, that want their children to be able to go to school safely. And so I think fundamentally we need to take back the commons for everybody, and we need to prioritize shelter. Last but not least, I think that prior to Measure 110, prior to the pandemic, Portland was already a city that was perceived as anything goes. And we had a very lax attitude towards urban camping. We had a very lax attitude towards drug use, even hard drug use. And then we doubled down with Measure 110, which, while it only decriminalized hard possession, it's been interpreted that it's okay to sell, that you aren't responsible for your behaviors. And I think that has essentially been a draw to those suffering from addiction, as well as a really negative criminal element that have sort of preyed at times on the city of Portland's compassion. And so I think we have to look at with clear eyes at the challenges of these unsheltered camps. There are certainly folks that deserve a real focused attention on. We have too many seniors, for example, that are housing unstable. We release in the state of Oregon hundreds and sometimes thousands of foster children with insufficient social capital. Those are segments of our population that we need to be very focused on supporting from a moral perspective, from a collective responsibility perspective. But the dudes who move here to do hard drugs on our streets and to commit crimes, there's no such moral obligation to those segments. We need to make this place less hospitable for them while we take care of those who we have a moral responsibility to.
You speak of prioritizing shelter. Well, what about the homeless population that refuses to go into shelter? Recent studies show that the majority of the people on the streets prefer to stay in their tents.
Yeah, so I think, again, we're going to have to segment that, not treat the whole, what I would call service-resistant population and unsheltered population the same. There are folks that have legitimate concerns about going to shelter, if particularly low barrier shelter. If you're a mother with children, if you're a senior, you often don't want to be in a shelter where you are around folks who have not treated their mental illness, that have not treated their substance use disorder. Those are very legitimate reasons why you may feel unsafe in a shelter. So with that segment, I think as a society we have to continue, those segments, we have to continue to be very proactive in finding shelter solutions that fit their particular needs. On the other end of the spectrum, if you don't want to go to shelter because you have a gun, because you want to use hard drugs, because you want to continue to engage in criminal activity, then I think they need to face the criminal justice system. And we can talk about that, that very diverse population, even of service-resistant folks in the unsheltered population. We have to segment them. They're not all the same. They don't all need to be treated the same. And recognizing some really negative behaviors that need to be addressed in a very direct way. And if you don't want to take shelter, then you're going to deal with the criminal justice system. And then on the other end, there are folks that have legitimate concerns that we need to meet halfway.
Do you really think that taking people off the streets and putting them into the criminal justice system, if that's the only option, is the best approach, since sometimes that just continues the cycle?
If they're engaging in car thefts, bike thefts, catalytic converter thefts, low-level vandalism, if they are breaking into stores to feed habits and they happen to hide out in our unsanctioned camps, I think we absolutely have to disrupt that cycle as soon as we can. I think that's to give Portlanders a sense of justice, that if they're being wronged by crimes, that they're going to get a response from the city, they're going to get a response from government. Right now we're prosecuting a fraction of the misdemeanors we did 10 years ago, and no one thinks crime has gone down. But we're somewhere around 20% or less of the misdemeanors we used to prosecute. So we have to disrupt that cycle for Portlanders who are following the rules. At the same time, I think there's a real belief that a substantial amount of those petty crimes are feeding addiction. They're feeding someone with substance use disorder. And what is going on our streets of Portland right now, we don't disrupt the cycle. We allow that to perpetuate itself over and over again. I would argue the more humane approach is to disrupt that, to interfere with the cycle of both self-destructive behavior and criminality in the streets of Portland.
You say if elected, you'll work to remove RVs and put them in safe locations. How will you do that, and where are these safe locations?
Yeah, so I think that I would say that the mayor has actually started to take some steps there, particularly in East Portland. We saw for extended periods of time, we had RVs parked in certain areas and cars for months, approaching years without interruption. I think we're going to have to find safe parking spots in a general sense. I think working with Metro on the Expo Center and see if we can rekindle that deal that has started and stopped a couple of times. And we're just going to have to continue to aggressively evaluate parking locations for RVs. At the same time, some of these RVs need to be taken out of commission. They're dumping illegally. They're not hospitable. And I think we need to look at better shelter for the folks who are relying on those really old RVs for their structure. So I think it's a combination, but we do have to put on the table big safe parking places, big shelter solutions, and I think it helps alleviate part of that RV problem.
So what is your response to Mayor Wheeler's 5-part plan that he announced last week?
I think directionally, it's a step in the right direction. I think it's recognizing the urgency of the problem. I agree with the commitment that we need to be driving towards the end of unsanctioned camping in Portland. So I like all of those pieces. I say that with some caveats. We may never fully solve the problem of unsanctioned camping. I mean, that's the reality of living in an urban situation. I think the goal has to be to end it, recognizing we may never fully reach that goal. I also think there's a lot of devil in the details, and it's a big, high-level plan, but that it's going to be heavily dependent on working successfully with other government partners to get all of the bureaus kind of operating in the same direction. So I like the direction, but it is going to be incumbent on all of us working together to execute on that, and that includes every city commissioner, the bureaus, and really finding common ground with our government partners to get on the same page on it. And so a lot of work still to be done on it is what I would say.
Are you behind all 5 resolutions, or is there something that stands out to you as problematic?
I think directionally I'm there. I'm supportive of it. And I think part of the challenge in our form of government, whether pre or post charter reform, is that at times the mayor is thrust into situations where they don't have sufficient power to address the crisis at hand. I think in our current form of government, it's going to be we're at a point in time where we need our mayor to succeed. So I think as a commissioner, part of it's going to be if the mayor's on the right path, I'm going to be supporting him. I'm going to be giving him backup. Sometimes that's giving him liquid courage. Sometimes that's demonstrated the backbone that if you're in the right direction, we're going to be supporting you. And that's where I am right now in the 5-point plan. I think, again, directionally, it's the step in the right direction. I haven't rigorously studied every element. I think once we see the implementation plan for the various pieces of it, there will be a lot of discussion on how best to do it. And certainly there's going to have to be feedback from other public partners. There's just no two ways about it.
Mm-hmm. You say if elected, you'll immediately clean up parks and neighborhoods. How do you plan to do that, and what approach will you take that's different from what the city's already doing with just clearing campsites and they move to the next neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've kind of dug into the details of our unsanctioned camps, I've sort of elevated the priority on going after that really hard criminal behavior that's going on. So if I was to look at the overall population of unsanctioned camp, I think early on in the campaign I didn't fully appreciate how rough the criminal element was in some of our unsanctioned camps. So first goal is to disrupt that criminality. We're looking at reestablishing a municipal court in the city of Portland. It's been about 50 years since we've had one. Part of that's to alleviate the county's challenges in addressing some of that low-level property crime that we think a substantial amount of it is coming from some of our unsanctioned camps. And part of it's going very directly after that element. Then second, for those that are in unsanctioned camps and are engaging in really socially destructive behavior beyond the property crimes, that just I think that's an area of focus of disruption. And then third, we've got to build a ton of shelter. And again, when I was bringing this topic up back in August of 2021, that was well ahead of where the city was on thinking big on the subject. I think the city has shifted in its rhetoric, I think in focus. So I'd be willing to bet on the mayor's plan at this point to address the issues that I described going back to August of last year. And again, the devil's going to be in the detail. There's a lot of work to be done to actually execute on that plan and to actually flesh it out and make it work. But I'd start with that.
There's a lack of addiction and mental health treatment facilities in Portland. What work would you do to try and address that crisis?
Yeah, I mean, so the reality for the city is that we're dependent on the county and state for delivery of both mental illness and addiction services, generally speaking, right? And that is our structure of social services in this region. And so the city has to be very strong advocates for mental illness and addiction services. That's our main lever is advocacy. Second, I do think there are some criminal justice pieces we can do specifically with respect to hard drugs accessibility on the streets of Portland, and meth and fentanyl particularly turning out to be so deadly and so destructive in our community. I think we prioritize that from a criminal justice perspective of disrupting the easy flow of those hard drugs on our streets. But at the end of the day, we are dependent on the state to get Measure 110 dollars online, the dollars that were promised in effective addiction services. And I think as Oregonians, as Portlanders, we all have to collectively be screaming on high to get those online as quickly as possible.
How will you ensure that these ideas don't just remain conceptual, and how do you plan to get the rest of City Hall behind you?
Well, I think City Hall is moving in the direction I've been articulating since I entered this race. I mean, I think Everyone's seeing the humanitarian crisis on our streets. Everyone's seeing the chaos on our streets. It's not. It's out in front of us every single day. And I'm running against the most radical member of City Council on these issues. At times, the most anti-law enforcement. At times, the most passive with respect to addressing unsheltered camps. And so you replace the most radical member of City Council with someone who I think is more in line with where the city wants to go in addressing these issues. I think we're going to have 3 to 4 votes very consistently on a lot of the things I'm describing. And I think the political environment has shifted since I entered the race. And I think that's a good thing for a lot of the things I'm advocating for.
Just lastly here, if homelessness is someone's #1 concern, why should they vote for you?
Because I'm going to address the issue head on. You know, I've been very direct from the day I entered this race about the crisis this was creating for livability in our city. I haven't looked at it with rose-colored glasses. I've looked at the data, I've studied the data, I've engaged constantly with those who interact with the homeless and the unsheltered populations in our cities. So and I have a history of working on complex problems. I led the statewide efforts to reopen schools as we were emerging from the pandemic. That took a data-driven approach to very complex public policy, public health challenges. And that's the right mindset for this. It's a combination of having some backbone, recognizing that there's going to be loud extremists that will object to no matter what you do, but at the same time, listening to those who are going to engage in a reasonable way and driving our decisions with data. And I'm looking forward to the challenge.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.